The date was July 1st, 1776. A man named Caesar Rodney was riding through a thunderstorm, 80 miles non-stop, fighting cancer and exhaustion. Why? To cast the tie-breaking vote that would separate America from Britain. Without his ride, independence might have died on the floor of Congress. This is the state that saved independence. The state that built the gunpowder for the Civil War. The first state to say yes to the Constitution. Welcome to the history of Delaware. To understand Delaware, you first have to understand where it sits. It occupies the northeastern tip of the Delmarva Peninsula, landmass shared by Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. See what they did there. But the state's destiny was really defined by water. Specifically, the Delaware River and Bay. In the age of sail, this was a superhighway into the American interior. Whoever controlled this river controlled trade. And that brings us to the name. The state is named after Thomas West, the 3rd Baron Delaware. He was the first colonial governor of Virginia. Ironically, historians aren't even 100% sure if he ever actually set foot on Delaware soil. But his name stuck to the river, and eventually, to the land itself. Of course, Baron Delaware didn't discover anything. For thousands of years, this land was the territory of the Lenape in the north, and the Nanticoke in the south. They called the river the Lenape. They were master farmers and fishermen who had complex societies long before the first European flags were planted in the sand. But by the early 1600s, the isolation of the New World was ending. European powers were hungry for territory, and because of its strategic location, Delaware wasn't just settled by one country, it became the wrestling ring for 3 different empires. First came the Dutch, then came the Swedes, and finally, the English, and it all started with a colony that ended in disaster. The story of colonial Delaware begins, not with a desire for land, but with a desire for whales. In the early 17th century, whale oil was liquid gold, and the Dutch believed that Delaware Bay was teeming with them. In 1631, a group of investors from the Dutch West India Company sent an expedition to establish a whaling station. They landed near what is now the town of Lewes and named their settlement Zwaanendael, or Valley of Swans, named for the beautiful birds they saw nesting on the shore. It seemed idyllic. They planted crops, built a brick house, and set up the coats of arms of the Dutch Republic. But this colony was doomed by a tragic cultural misunderstanding. According to legend, a local Lenape chief took one of the tin coats of arms to make pipes. The Dutch commander complained, and the tribe, misunderstanding the severity of the offense, killed the chief to appease the settlers. This horrified the Dutch, but it enraged the chief's tribe even more. In retaliation, the tribe descended on Zwaanendael. They burned the fort and killed all 32 settlers. When a second Dutch ship arrived a year later, they found nothing but bleached bones and charred wood. The Valley of Swans had become a valley of death. The Dutch retreated, leaving the land open once again. But their brief presence was crucial. It established a legal claim that would later prevent the English from simply absorbing the territory into Maryland. The blood spilled at Zwaanendael ironically saved Delaware's future autonomy. With the Dutch gone, a new player entered the game: Sweden. It was the era of the 30 Years' War, and Sweden was a European superpower looking for its own slice of the New World. In 1638, the ship Kalmar Nickel, captained by Peter Minuit, the same man who had famously brought Manhattan sailed up the Delaware River. They landed at a natural rock wharf in present-day Wilmington. They built a stronghold called Fort Christina, named after their young queen. This was the birth of New Sweden. Unlike the Dutch, the Swedes cultivated excellent relationships with the local Susquehannock and Lenape tribes, focusing on fur trading rather than conquest. But New Sweden's greatest contribution wasn't political. It was architectural. The Finnish settlers who came with the Swedes brought a specific building technique from the heavily forested Scandinavia, the log cabin. Before this, English settlers built framed houses that were difficult to construct in the wilderness. The Swedes showed America how to stack logs with notched corners, simple, durable, and warm. That image of the rugged American pioneer in a log cabin, that was born right here in Wilmington, Delaware. However, New Sweden was short-lived. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, jealous of the Swedish control of the river, invaded in 1655 with 7 ships. The Swedes, vastly outnumbered, surrendered without a fight. The colony of New Sweden lasted only 17 years, yet its cultural fingerprint on the Delaware Valley remains visible to this day. the Dutch didn't hold their prize for long. In 1664, the English fleet arrived, seizing all of New Netherland, including Delaware, for the Duke of York. But the man who would truly shape Delaware's borders was William Penn. When Penn was granted the massive land of Pennsylvania, he had a problem. His land was landlocked. He needed access to the ocean. So, the Duke of York leased the lower 3 counties, what is now Delaware, to William Penn in 1682. For decades, Delaware was technically part of Pennsylvania. We shared a governor and a general assembly. But the cultures were different. Pennsylvania was Quaker and pacifist. Delaware was diverse, commercial, and more willing to fight for defense. This era gave us one of the weirdest borders in the United States, the 12-mile circle. The deed stated Penn's land extended for 12 miles around the town of Newcastle. Surveyors literally took a compass point at the cupola of the Newcastle courthouse and drew an arc. This circle creates the curved northern border with Pennsylvania. But here is the kicker. Usually, river borders are split down the middle. But because of this specific royal grant, Delaware owns the entire Delaware River up to the low tide mark on the New Jersey side within that circle. To this day, if you are standing on the shoreline in New Jersey inside that circle, and you step into the water, you are technically in Delaware. This 17th century geometry has caused Supreme Court lawsuits between the two states as recently as the 2000s. By 1776, the lower counties had effectively separated from Pennsylvania, forming their own assembly. But the question of total independence from Britain threatened to tear the tiny colony apart. Delaware was full of loyalists who wanted to stay with the king. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was voting on independence. Delaware had 3 delegates. Thomas McKean voted yes. George Reed voted no, believing it was too soon. The delegation was deadlocked. The 3rd delegate, Caesar Rodney, was absent. He was 80 miles away at his farm near Dover, suffering from asthma and facial cancer. On the night of July 1st, McKean sent a rider to fetch Rodney. Upon hearing the news, Rodney didn't hesitate. He mounted his horse and rode through a severe thunderstorm, stopping only briefly to change horses. He rode all night, covering 80 miles of muddy, washed-out roads. On July 2nd, still in his riding boots and covered in mud, Caesar Rodney stumbled into the Pennsylvania State House. When his name was called, he struggled to his feet and declared, "As I believe the voice of my constituents and of all sensible and honest men is in favor of it, my judgment concurs." He broke the tie. Delaware voted for independence. Without Rodney's ride, the resolution might not have passed unanimously, and the history of the world might have looked very different. Winning the war was one thing. Surviving the peace was another. Under the Articles of Confederation, the new United States was a mess. Small states like Delaware were terrified. They feared that massive neighbors like Virginia and Pennsylvania would bully them, tax their goods, and swallow up their territory. Delaware knew its only survival lay in a strong national union where every state, regardless of size, had 2 senators. When the new Constitution was proposed in Philadelphia, offering exactly that equality in the Senate, Delaware didn't hesitate. 30 delegates met at the Golden Fleece Tavern in Dover. It wasn't a long debate. On December 7, 1787, they voted 30-0 to ratify the Constitution. This is why, whenever there is a presidential inauguration or a parade of states, Delaware always goes first. It is a point of immense pride. They were the first to agree to the experiment that became the United States of America. As the 19th century progressed, Delaware occupied a dangerous middle ground. It was technically a slave. State slavery remained legal here until 1865. However, the economy had shifted away from tobacco, and by 1860, 90% of Delaware's black population was already free. But for those still enslaved, Delaware was the final hurdle before freedom. This made the state a critical battleground for the Underground Railroad. The central hero of this story is Thomas Garrett, a Quaker iron merchant in Wilmington. Garrett was the station master of the line. He worked closely with the legendary Harriet Tubman, who passed through Delaware on her journeys. Garrett openly defied the law. Even after being fined into bankruptcy by federal authorities for helping runaways, he stood up in court and told the judge he would double his efforts. And he did. He is credited with helping over 2,700 people escape to freedom. Yet, the shadow of slavery was long. In the public square of Newcastle, whipping posts and auction blocks remained active. It was a state of extreme contradictions, where where a free black man could own a business in Wilmington, while a few miles south, human beings were still being sold. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Delaware was a border state. It was a slave state that remained in the Union. President Lincoln was terrified that if Delaware seceded, Maryland would follow, leaving the capital, Washington, D.C., completely surrounded by Confederate territory. Delaware stayed loyal, but just barely. The northern part of the state was staunchly Union. The southern part, Sussex County, was deeply sympathetic to the Confederacy. It was truly brother against brother. Delaware regiments fought for the North, while many individual Delawareans sneaked south to fight for Virginia. The state's biggest role in the war, however, was as a prison. Fort Delaware, located on Pea Patch Island in the middle of the river, was known as the Andersonville of the North. It was designed to protect Philadelphia, but it ended up holding 33,000 Confederate prisoners of war. Conditions were brutal, damp, mosquito-infested, and overcrowded. Today, 2,400 Confederate soldiers are buried in a mass grave on the Jersey Shore nearby. It remains one of the most haunted sites in American history. While politicians debated, a French immigrant family was building an empire that would define Delaware for the next 2 centuries. Eluther Irene DuPont arrived in America in 1800. He noticed that American gunpowder was terrible quality. He knew how to make it better. In 1802, he purchased land on the Brandywine River near Wilmington. The river provided the water power to grind the charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter. The E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company was born. It was dangerous work. The mills were built with 3 heavy stone walls and 1 flimsy wooden wall facing the river. If an explosion happened, and they often did, the blast would go out toward the water, saving the other mills. By the mid-19th century, DuPont was the primary supplier of gunpowder to the U.S. military. They supplied the powder that opened the West, blasted the railroad tunnels, and fought the Civil War. This family dynasty transformed Wilmington into a chemical capital, creating a level of wealth and philanthropy, schools, highways, hospitals that earned Delaware the nickname the Company State. For centuries, the Delaware coast was just sand dunes and mosquitoes. That changed in the 1870s with the arrival of the railroad. Religious groups saw the pristine beaches as the perfect place for spiritual retreats. Rehoboth Beach actually started as the Rehoboth Beach Camp Meeting Association of the Methodist Episcopal Church. People bought tent plots to listen to sermons by the sea. This circular layout of the camp meetings still defines the street map of downtown Rehoboth today. But nature reminded the residents who was really in charge. In March 1962, the Ash Wednesday storm hit. It wasn't a hurricane. It was a nor'easter that stalled over the coast for 5 high tides. The devastation was biblical. Boardwalks were smashed, and houses were ripped from their foundations and floated across the bay. The storm flattened the dunes, but it led to a massive rebuilding effort that transformed the sleepy religious camps into the bustling summer resort towns we know today. In the late 1970s, Delaware's economy was struggling. The old heavy industries were fading. The state needed a miracle. They found it in a law book. In 1981, under Governor Pierre S. DuPont, the state passed the Financial Center Development Act. It removed caps on the interest rates banks could charge. At the time, inflation was high, and banks in New York were losing money. Delaware rolled out the red carpet. Almost overnight, major banks like J.P. Morgan and Chase moved their credit card operations to Wilmington. But it wasn't just banks. Delaware's Court of Chancery is unique. It uses judges who are experts in corporate law, rather than juries, to decide business disputes. This predictability is business gold. Today, this legal framework is Delaware's biggest export. There is a single building in Wilmington, 1209 North Orange Street, that is the registered legal address of over 285,000 companies, including Google, Apple, and Coca-Cola, from a Swedish log cabin colony to the corporate capital of the world. Delaware's history is a masterclass in adaptation. Delaware is often joked about as a drive-through starter place. You pass on your way to somewhere else. But as we've seen, if you don't stop and look, you miss the foundation of America itself. From the blood-soaked soil of the Zwaanendael Colony to the boardrooms that control the global economy today. From the brave midnight ride that saved independence to the station masters who guided the enslaved to freedom. This tiny strip of sand and soil has constantly punched above its weight class. It is a place of firsts. The first log cabin, the first star on the flag, the first step toward a new kind of nation. They call it the small wonder, but the history of Delaware proves that influence isn't measured in square miles. It is measured in action, and for 300 years, the first state has been right in the middle of the action. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, it really helps the channel grow. And if you want to see more American history uncovered, make sure you are subscribed with the notification bell on. I want to hear from you in the comments. We covered a lot of ground today, but what is the most surprising thing you learned about Delaware? Was it the log cabins, the gunpowder, or the 12-mile circle? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.